This has been because of my ongoing thoughts about the role of an ideal citizen in different countries, and I am here speak as a sociologist. I'd like to point out that I have tried to be a critical sociologist. Critical sociology is a whole school of thought, which implies a disagreement or going against what is usually generally accepted, and an ongoing search for something ambiguous, inequalities and hierarchies, something alternative to what is being presented to us as an ideal or universal or whatever. And this approach towards the role of an ideal citizen and the model of citizenship that they present to us, and the role of intelligentsia that is particularly important for Poland, because I'll be speaking about Poland. I'm within this critical model that, on the one hand, I can see just peerless importance and meaning of these ideas and rules, but on the other hand, I keep thinking whether there might be here some kind of unnamed, maybe a hierarchical, one may put it this way, or symbolic violence, as sociologists say. Well, I think that in the sense, my approach is just a matter of continuous tension within myself, is because I'm convinced that we cannot live without these values on the one hand, but on the other hand, in these values, there are a lot of, as I told you, unnamed hierarchical inequalities that are being actually manifested by these ideals. And this approach is actually historical in its essence. I'll discuss at length history, and this is again something not typical of all sociologists, and again our common interest for intelligentsia is not something typical of Poland today, for example. Many people will tell you that the word intelligentsia plays no role whatsoever in Poland. All the ideals are long gone. Historically, yes, intelligentsia may have mattered in the history of Poland for some researchers, but for modern life, it doesn't seem to be relevant at all. I will try to convince you that I am deeply convinced that this is not this case. Unless we look in our history, we cannot understand what is going on today. But, of course, we cannot identify things that happened in the past with what is going on today. The main topic here is this ideal of civic ideal or ideal citizen. I would like to speak to him referring to well-known American theoreticians. First, Geoffrey Alexander from Yale, and then Roger Brubaker, who worked on the evolution of modern French and German state and the notion of an ideal citizen in France and Germany. And then I would like to refer to a well-known Polish philosopher and historian, Andrzej, and to add something from my perspective. The main idea here is that modern civic model in Western states is based upon the idea of full equality and of citizens that one can be persuaded that modern civil society in the West is a society of equal citizens whose status is in no way different from one another. But critical sociologists might show us that it is not quite so. And this has to do, first of all, with historic origins of this Western model, and especially in some countries. And one can say that in some countries there are ideal models of citizens. They're not really described in constitution, but its image is laid down in works of art, in classical literature, in cultural texts, where they discuss a man or people who personify this ideal citizen of their country. And this English theoretician Marshall was one of the first to give the name, this model, for England by giving it the term. It was a gentleman for England, and for America it was an entrepreneur. And he thus noted that in America, when they speak about an ideal citizen, in most cases they refer to a very enterprising, independent, self-willed person. It better be an entrepreneur. He should have the kind of creating a startup. Whereas in England, they continue to entertain the idea of a gentleman who is sort of a mix of a bourgeois representative with an aristocrat, or a mixture with aristocrat. They are unnamed in legal documents, but this is something that determines what exists in those societies. This is invisible hierarchy in the society, and those who fit better into this model role, they are more desirable and they are more ideal citizens, if we may say. And this word describes and strengthens sometimes this invisible hierarchy, but implied hierarchy. Despite all claims to equality, despite politicians claiming equality, it turns out in real life we've got citizens who are better complying with this ideal, and there are others who do not fully, or maybe pretty far away from this ideal. And this mechanism, this is where you can see classical mechanism of hierarchization of modern Western societies, where an ideal is a chief element of that is the basis for inequality, where the hierarchy sort of like is the basis for, despite again all the claims in theory to the mottos and slogans of equality. What I want to say that in Poland this ideal citizen is a representative of Polish intelligentsia. He had better hail from Polish szlachta, that is nobility. And now in brief, the approach by Jeffrey Alexander, who convinces us that in point of fact, modern society is built along these ideals of civil society, goes back to religious foundations in a sense that in any society, including modern Western society, it's based upon a binary code. And the division between the clean and not clean, and in a civil society or Gentile and in the civil societies, this is an ideal citizen, whose opposition would be a person who in no way or no degree doesn't seem to meet these ideals of civil society. And what is interesting here is that Alexander argues with left sociologists and disagrees with left intellectuals, for whom all the problems of democracy boil down to economy alone. We think that economically you can ensure economic equality and this will resolve all the problems of But he convinces that it's far from that. Economic hierarchy, of course, matters greatly. And there is inequality, but democracy is an independent, autonomous area, autonomous dimension of society. But on the other hand, he criticizes extreme right liberals who claim that, in point of fact, something pretty similar, but in an opposite sense. They claim that the market, free economy, free it is, it will automatically build an ideal society. He also argues with the left, extremely critical intellectual sociologists who assert that there is democratic discourse and it's all about false ideology. And this is just deception, pure deception and lies, because these hierarchies are present everywhere and behind every motto, slogan, identity, and there always stands behind hierarchy of somebody's interests, vested interests. I suppose it's a very important dispute, and for me, I haven't yet resolved this question for me. This is what I started with. In point of fact, behind every ideal slogan, you can see somebody's vested interests. But on the other hand, Alexander says it would be tantamount to nihilism if we will seek to so to say, if we try to look from this perspective alone, seeking to limit it to only considering these interests that stand behind any and every value. Because he claims that this society, as I was saying before, the society is built along these multiple autonomies of economy and, on the other hand, democracy. It would be wrong, as he asserts, to believe that economic and political interests alone should be identified with the logic of democracy. Nevertheless, he shows that what stands behind that logic and ideal democracy, that behind them there are some inequalities, interests, and so on. And he particularly speaks about historic origin of this modern American, first of all, model. He shows that it is rising from the ethos of knights that later would convert into Protestant ideals and gradually would become universally accepted and adopted. And the same is, as he points out, he sees influence of several religious traditions: Judaism, Christianity, Protestantism, liberal, socialist thought, and all that can be thoroughly reconstructed. But at this point in time, out of these very many historic roots, they gave rise to a simple model which is based upon these binary oppositions between what is democratic and what is not perceived as non-democratic. How should an ideal civil society, what it would look like? And he sees three dimensions: motives, relations, and institutions. But mostly, binary opposition is about rational and irrational. And whatever is rational is good, and what is not rational is bad. And this is where he suggests specific dimensions, motives. A good citizen is always active, autonomous, rational, more realistic, and so on, whereas a bad citizen is passive, dependent in their relations. These relations are open, critical, altruistic, trusting, and so on, and so on. Whereas institutions and law should be regulated by law and should not be open or whatever, and so on. He says that in Western society this is not disputed. It is quite legitimate, and you cannot dispute that. But what is a matter of dispute, in pretty intense debate in Western society, is the way this ideal is, in some specific circumstances, the way this ideal should be consumed. Who, in point of fact, fully meets the qualities of this ideal and who doesn't live up to that. It's easy to notice that if we look at the political debate in the Western countries, the main accusation lies in not meeting up these criteria of ideal. My opponents are violating these principles. They do not trust, they are closed, they are not rational, and so on and so forth. It just highlights that he wants to identify it with class disputes. Sometimes different groups of diverging economic interests would be using this discourse, and our opponents are not breaching this ideal of ideal civil society. And as again he pointed out, he notes that given this historic roots of this model, and one can say that several groups of privileged Western societies, because this ideal historically evolved in a certain context where certain cultural, religious groups were ruling groups or under influence, and what follows is the consequence is that certain cultural and religious ideals are more valuable than others. And this is where he gives examples of Protestants on the one side, who still, although nobody would ever admit that, are still valued much higher than Catholics. Those who have English or origin stock are valued much higher than Latinos. People who coming from Northern Europe hold a much higher position than those who hail from Eastern Europe. And he just points out that this mechanism is inevitable, because of this, it is inevitable because of historic genesis of any model. In any country, there is a historic myth that portrays an ideal citizen that is seen on the one hand as quite an abstract ideal, and this model implies that any person can fit into these ideals. But since any model is just historic, in practice, people of certain identity, of family background, national background, ethnic background, fit in higher or lower in this political and cultural life of the country. And he speaks about France, where a bourgeois is perceived to be an ideal citizen, which is also a myth. Well, Alexander believes that all those historic hierarchies can be overcome, where one builds an ideal society where any difference will be perceived as a value, but I'm not quite confident that this is the case. But we can argue about this. Maybe one day, maybe someday, this historic hierarchy may be overcome. But now I'd like to say a few words about another American theoretician, Rogers Burbecker, who compared the civil ideals in France and Germany. In his deliberations, as he thought, the main problem was class affiliation. In America, as I say, they do have this question of ethnic background or religious affiliation, where they have their own hierarchies, but the most important problem is economic. And the question about an ideal citizen, it's a question about to which extent the myth of an ideal citizen, to which extent it reproduces economic hierarchy, whereas in European countries, more often than not, it mostly has to do with a national problem. To which extent the myth of an ideal citizen reproduces the national or ethnic inequalities. And the most well-known here is comparison of the French and German models that until now are maintaining and still do see the main difference between law and mechanism of recognition of citizenship. The French law still continues to be based upon the law on land. The very fact that one is born on the French territory, on the French soil, is the main reason for awarding citizenship, whereas in Germany it's still the law on blood. It means that a German citizen is somebody who was born by German parents. And Brubaker shows that, again, it is predetermined historically. In France, an ideal of enlightenment prevailed, whereas in Germany, an ideal of romanticism. People is a cultural and ethnic community, whereas in France, this is the state that prevails as a political community. And the roots of these differences, as Brubaker thinks, apart from this legal and value-based, when there is opposition between enlightenment and
in addition to that, we can see a difference in the power of the state. France at that time is believed to have been a very strong state. So there was this myth that France was in a position to perpetrate, and the strength of the French culture was so portentous that it was easy for the French state to achieve this status of glory. And indeed, those who wanted to become French citizens were imbibing the French culture. Well, in Germany, the situation was a lot more difficult. Germany was and formally continues to be a federative state. The German culture definitely had a high prestige, but not as high as French. And those who stay in Germany, although the situation is somewhat changing, but at that time in the 19th century, those who stayed in Germany were primarily ethnic minorities, like Poles, and the fact that the right of blood law, which was accepted in Germany, was to an extent due to the big Polish minority, which the German state simply could not Germanify, which became, to an extent, source of these laws, including the deportation of the Poles. And thus this ideal of the blood-based citizenship, or the right of blood, became a precept of the German state. Up until now, this is an impediment on the part of the German state to implement its policies with respect to many of the problems, which in a way contradicted to the French ideal. There is a point to be made about the 19th century contradictions. Is that part of the state institutions were trying to Germanify, and another segment or part of the state institutions in Germany were, on the contrary, alienating them from the state system. From this standpoint, it is an equal interest and importance to consider the Austrian experience, because we remember that Poland was divided between Russia, Austria, and Germany, and the Austrian legacy is still believed to be the most democratic in Poland, if we compare this to the Russian heritage and the Prussian heritage. Both the Russian and Prussian heritage are regarded to be as negative, but the Austrian legacy in the part of Poland which is called Galicia, as is well known, is generally believed to be a more benevolent heritage, primarily insofar as in the end of the 19th century, Austria was relatively democratic and kept a significant degree of autonomy. But if you look at the history of the Austrian state and later the Austrian-Hungarian state, then you'd see that the Austrians were trying to build a system of national state on the French model. And they even started to build a network of schools in Galicia to have this imperial educational universal model in German. So an ideal has been for all citizens of the Austrian state to be German-speaking and loyal citizens of the Austrian Empire. But in the wake of the loss of the war against Prussia, a very different model was adopted, and in the end of the 19th century, a significant part of autonomy was granted to Galicia, which to an extent shows the paradox of these ideals. While we still believe to be the Austrian model the most democratic in the end of the 19th and end of the beginning of the 20th century, but in many ways this democratic nature is predicated on and predetermined by the weakness of the Austrian state. And while we look at the French model, believed to be an ideal, we should recognize that the success of the French model was to a large extent based on the repressive nature of the French étatisme, and indeed the urge to accept the French language and the French identity as the only possible identity and the only acceptable state language. So let me say a few words about the Polish experience through the prism of a prominent Polish author, WALICKI, who argues and debates the questions as Poland and other Central European countries are viewed in the West. He especially debates the simplified approach towards the category of the state and and national identity, and the cultural unity, and on the other side, the political unity. He mentions that to many, the Central and Eastern Europe is a region where national states dominate, as based on the citizenship determined by the dominating culture, and primarily the French culture, which we see as a mode of political hierarchy, because all citizens, all French are citizens. All persons with French passport are French. And the author says that this is a lot more sophisticated and complicated. And talking about Poland, he maintains that it is impossible to make to introduce Poland into this model, because in Poland there have always been elements of political citizenship belonging to the Polish society on the political basis, and there have always been elements of the national or ethnic belonging. He mentions that the Polish revolts of the 19th century had these two elements, this national and political dimension. And to these persons, to those who went to rebel, Poland was a political ideal against imperial domination, primarily Russian domination and others, and which were believed not just to be national, but also non-free states. And in these political ideals, Poland was a project of liberating of nations. It is interesting to have another debate touched upon by WALICKI, which continues in Poland until today, is the place of the heritage of the first Rzeczpospolita, Polish-Livonian state. Polish-Lithuanian state at the end of the 18th century. And this debate still ensues in Poland. There has been a myth that this was a positive story, that this was an ideal republic, an antique style, classical style republic based on the ideals of the classical antiquity, although of course this was the Szlachty or the nobility based republic. Only the nobles were citizens, but those who nurtured this myth remind us that nobility in Poland had a very high, up to 15% of the citizens in Poland had this status. And in this sense, Poland, by the historical measurements, was the most democratic state in Europe. And as you know, the Polish Republic is still called Rzeczpospolita, and there is this even in the name there is this continuation of the tradition. But many believe that this is wrong, that this is a wrong theory, because this was a feudal republic and certainly not a democratic state, primarily because power was arrogated by a relatively limited group of the nobles, and it was just a very archaic state. But WALICKI maintains that this is not particularly important because this myth was easily modernized. Think of the 19th century, whereby the Polish intellectuals, started from Henryk Sienkiewicz, introduced this myth into the modern Polish ideal of an intellectual, an heir to this szlachecki noble ideals of Rzeczpospolita, and he also mentioned that Marx and Engels believed that the Polish idea based on these ideas are the ideas of a political, democratic nation. WALICKI also says that even the bourgeois partially took up this ideal, and the intellectuals also introduced and understood this ideal, especially with the conservatives. And the conservatives are entirely for this ideal, whereas those on the left wing of the political spectrum are a lot more reticent, are a lot more self-possessed, with the feudal perceptions and something that is not needed. And to me, this is not a path that has been supported, but there is a point here about idealization of the myth. And he has shown that the French Revolution is a myth. And if we look at the political history of the French Revolution, of the French democracy, then there we can also see many things which do not coincide with these ideals. And it is equally to see how these ideals were developed in the post-war or the interwar period. Józef Piłsudski and Roman Dmowski were disputing this. Piłsudski is still believed to be a great Pole. You'll see his monument, but Piłsudski, of course, Piłsudski has a much higher status, and as to the Dmowski had and is widely regarded, especially in the left wing of this political spectrum, as an ardent nationalist, and Dmowski was definitely seen as a pro-nationalist figure. This definitely relates to the deliberations at the time of the Versailles Peace Conference and the Riga Treaty with the USSR, whereby the boundary between Poland and the Soviet Union was considered, and Dmowski wanted to have the boundary being more moved to the west. He was not much interested in the Ukrainian and the Belarusian lands, and Dmowski said that Poland would not be in a position to govern the regions where Poles would be a minority. We need to have a strong nationalist and nation state, and because we have a somewhat weak state, we need to have a more compact Poland. Whereas Piłsudski was basing himself on the idea of Rzeczpospolita as a multi-ethnic federation, a democratic federation, but quite a national a multinational federation, and his supporters were certainly for having nearly all of the Ukraine and all of the Belarusia, and citizenship in this new state was to be based on the political identity and not ethnic Polish identity. Up until now, this is believed to be the right ideal. Generally coinciding with the common Western ideal of a civic society. However, in other countries, in our coterminous countries, in our neighboring countries, in Lithuania, Belarus, this is widely regarded as Polish imperialism, and the attempts to include these countries it comes from the Polish imperialism, which literally presupposes a Polonization of these nations, whereas the Lithuanians and the Poles were unequal in that ancient Polish republic, which, after all, shows an uneven attitude towards this ideal. And finally, let me get back to the question of intellectuals or intelligentsia. Here I primarily spoke about ethnicities, models of national dimensions of the models of citizenship. And indeed the ambiguity of this concept. However, towards the end of my presentation, I would like to talk about the class ambiguities, and in a way go back to what Jeffrey Alexander used to speak about, whereby this English entrepreneur or English an entrepreneur of the English blood who is still believed to be that ideal citizen, but in the Polish ideal of an intellectual coming from the Szlachty time comes from the time of 1918, when the Second Polish Republic was born. The first Polish Republic was based on the rights of the nobles. This was the aristocratic Polish Republic. Then, in the 19th century, starting from the Constitution of the 3rd of May, from the fall of that First Republic, there was this idea of landowners, which are based on the ideal of landowners, ziemianin, who is a true citizen. And only in the end of the 19th century, the intellectuals became a new stratum, a new elite, which, as it is often debated, comes to make this turn of the tide from nobility to landowner. And this first approach, this first turn, may be called a first modernization, the departure of the pure aristocratic principle to a more democratic approach, whereby every person who could buy a certain area of land, that citizen is entitled to the full suffrage. Then we go through what I call the intellectual revolution in Poland in 1918. In the 19th century, it was often talked about this landowners' citizenship as something which is which was and the Polish elite, which lived in the Prussian, Russian, and Austrian empires. This was the civic elite of a non-existing state. But the Polish society, in this informal way, was calling these citizens. But then the October Revolution, the First World War, led to the creation of the Second Polish Republic, which I think was based on the ideal of a new type, this intellectual or representative of an intelligentsia. And I suggest an approach towards history of the Polish 19th century that it can be looked at the level of the elites as a contradiction. And indeed, the aristocratic elites and the so-called intelligentsia elites. And we can see this element of opposition, whereby the intelligentsia, and not all historians agree with that view, but I think that intelligentsia was quite enthusiastic about this process of nation building, and even though there were a lot of losses among both the intelligentsia and the Szlachty, the nobility, the political role of the intelligentsia was rising. The economic elites were not so instrumental and a little bit reluctant to join these revolts against the three empires, and clearly that their losses were material, and the Russian Empire was often confiscating the property. And then finally the Bolshevik Revolution, whereas much of the property was lost by the Polish landowners, and many of them remember the Riga Treaty as the most tragic page in the histories of their families. But to the intelligentsia, this was not the case, and 1918 was the year of big national revival. And the fact that some families lost millions of hectares somewhere in the east was inconsequential. So here I'm in a way comparing the Russian and the Polish peoples after the Bolshevik Revolution. The Poles were building an intelligentsia-based revolution with the ruling class coming to the helm, whereas in the Russian Revolution we're seeing a new political class that was formed. And in a way, these two paths continue, and in Russia and in Poland we can see still these differences in spite of the communist experience. Intelligentsia is still this ruling class, starting from 1918. And this is a point which is not shared by many Polish intellectuals, and especially those conservative would say that the communism and World War II killed out the true Polish intelligentsia. And what we see today are the communists who opened up universities for the proletariat, and what we see today. If you're meeting some Polish intellectuals, this has nothing to do with the old Polish elite. Has nothing to do with the Polish noble class. However, I would object in saying that while there was a big influx of non-noble provenance into this class of intelligentsia, in Poland the communist regime was not able to lead to sedition of this class, and indeed was not able to subvert it. Throughout the communist years in Poland, intelligentsia was still considered to be the crème de la crème of the Polish society, and the entire mythology, even though tarnished by the communist staples, was still made a part of that mythology, so that highly educated persons were continued to be a part of the elite. So we never had the classical nomenclatura project, and even though there was the communist nomenclatura present in Poland, most of the children of the communist politicians and the functionaries of this period ran in a different course from the standpoint of the overall Polish political history of the 20th century, and a lot of people who literally deviated from the nomenclatura pensioned of their parents. Then, of course, there was the point of Polish intellectuals who were joining this elite, and there were these elements of the historical heritage and coming from the noble class, but also joined of the intelligence or intellectuals, depending on how we treat the word, coming from a more humble stock, including the proletarians and the peasantry or the rural people. However, this myth or ideal of intelligence-based society is still reigning high. Well, this is a little bit of a provocative presentation that I'm making, while I realize that against the background of the tensions that exist in Poland today, and it may well be seen as an attempt to say that whatever the disputes and whatever the controversies in the Polish society, these all stem from one intelligentsia stock, but we should just be consider this as part of the narrative.
And whose political ideas are based upon this intelligentsia identity. Despite all this debate, which sometimes is emotional, some strongly promote intelligentsia ideal. They think that they are right. They say in many ways this is because intelligentsia just doesn't live up to intelligentsia ideals. They should distance themselves from the government and the authorities, but most importantly, what they think that they are a real model that everybody keeps referring to. But in this sense, I've been saying that this is a paradox. One could say, on the one hand, that it is quite a shameful thing that the existence of this ideal helps continue to build some kind of democratic model to sustain it in some way. But on the other hand, one may claim, as I've been trying to do, that there is a certain hidden hierarchy about that keep telling us about these political things, but one might point out that despite all this debate, we still see this social inequality and, for example, intelligentsia, and all other classes who cannot fully live up to the ideals of intelligentsia. And again, as I was saying, all this is history on the one hand, but on the other hand, this is modern policy and politics and modern inequality in society. And this is where one should be very cautious in historic interpretation, that without it one cannot understand what has been going on. But on the other hand, you cannot disregard or read more historic heritage and read it as if it were still relevant as in the debate today, as an ongoing debate. I would stop at that. Thank you.